Sure.
Everybody ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on our title, Prospective Trajectories of Terrorism in Africa. My name is Dr. Barend Prinsloo, and I head our program in Security Studies and Management here at Northwest University. This colloquium is hosted by the School of Government Studies, which is situated in the Faculty of Humanities at the Northwest University. In this respect, I would like to thank Prof in this regard for his kind support for this colloquium. And I would like to ask him to do a quick opening for us. Prof Barend.
Thank you, Dr. Prinsloo. Colleagues, a very good morning to every one of you, and thank you so much for joining us from your respective places, countries. We are honestly warmed by your participation and interest in this topic, and we hope to continue to be of service to you in similar conversations in future. But colleagues, just allow me to say we are from the Northwest University. We are an academic public higher education institution in South Africa. As Dr. Prinsloo said, that we are in the Faculty of Humanities. The university, our university colleagues, has got 3 campuses, so it's a multi-campus site in the various provinces in South Africa, in various towns in South Africa. In the Vaal, it's a little bit of a different province, it's in Gauteng, and we've got the Northwest province in Potchefstroom, as well as Mafikeng campus. I'm working from Mafikeng this week. Our school has a range of qualifications, colleagues. We offer degrees in public administration, in political science, in international relations, and as Dr. Prinsloo says, also in security studies. We do have partners, academics, government, NGO partners, but we are still expanding. And if colleagues want to join us as research fellows, as extraordinary and adjunct professors, please feel free to contact any of us. Our contact details are on our university website. And you are most welcome, colleagues, to interact with us as often as possible. The topic for today, ladies and gentlemen, is on the prospective trajectories of terrorism in Africa. And as you will notice, we've got an exciting lineup of speakers based in South Africa, but Dr. James Armstead is based in California in the United States. And I just want to welcome Dr. Alta Grobler, Prof Hussein Solomon, and our own colleague, Dr. Piet Krokamp, as well as Jim in California. Colleagues, we're looking forward to your talk and engagement. I think, as you will agree with me, this conversation is very timely. Our world has become highly insecure, and there are so many issues. There are issues of terrorism, there are issues of social media, there are issues of poverty. So in a way, we want to continue to maintain our relevance to our stakeholders, to our communities, to our governments in arranging this kind of platforms with speakers of your caliber, so that we are able to continue to impact and influence public policy in more ways than one. Having said that, colleagues, thank you. Have a lovely discourse this morning. Thank you, Program Director.
Thank you very much, Prof Barend, for that introduction. As you have said, this theme of the colloquium was actually inspired by the events which are unfolding at the moment in northern Mozambique. And today there will be a wider discussion on the expansion of terrorist activities in Africa. Our presenters, as you have said, are from the United States, the University of the Free State, and the Northwest University itself. Before I introduce to you the first presenter, I just want to explain some proceedings for the colloquium, so that we can do it in an orderly fashion. The first one is, I'm asking that all participants just mute their microphones during the presentations so that we don't have feedback. I also want to just say that if you, I don't know if everybody's familiar with Zoom, if you know where the chat function is, please switch that on, because what we're going to do is, as the presenter is presenting, you will be allowed to ask questions, and we will then in the chat box, and then we will in the question and answer section, we will answer these questions, or the respective presenter will answer the questions. So just to make it clear, we will not take any questions following a presentation. Lastly, I just want to say this colloquium is recorded, like you've probably have noticed, and it will be made available afterwards on several platforms, including on our Facebook page, YouTube, and the school's website. So if you miss anything, you can just go there. If you want to see your face, you're allowed to switch on the camera. Some people like that. So keep that on if you want to. Okay, let me begin by introducing our first presenter today. I'm very excited to have her here. It's Dr. Alte Grobelaar, who is attached to the University of the Free State. She specializes in terrorism, the media, and political discourse. And this is an exciting field of terrorism research, and therefore it's our pleasure to welcome Dr. Grobelaar to present on a topic of whether or not social media is the new frontline of online terrorism in Africa. Dr. Grobelaar, you may go ahead.
Thank you so much. I just want to make sure if I am heard.
Yes.
Wonderful. All right, so I just will share my screen. All right, I think you should be able to see my presentation. There we go. All right, so yeah, I'm asking the question whether social media is the new frontline of terrorism in Africa. And the key part of the question there is in Africa. It is not unusual to use new means of technology to recruit, advertise, radicalize, and train people into terrorism. We all know this, we've heard this, it's not news. And the growth of the internet and the spread of mobile phones in Africa have increased the use of social media. And social media differs from what we know as conventional media. The media and even the internet is not necessarily new concepts, even in Africa. Social media means increased interactivity, increased reach, usability. Anyone is now a journalist, anyone is a publisher, anyone is a broadcaster, a filmmaker, and even an editor. And traditional media was more a sense of a one-to-many approach. So someone would post something and many people would be able to view it. Where with social media, anyone can do basically anything. So anyone is now able to write whatever they like. So everyone now has a powerful computer, camera, and film editor in their back pocket. And algorithms within social media are specifically created to connect people with similar interests to one another. And social media in this way enables greater mobilization. So access to like-minded groups, chats, and channels are done for you. So the work is much less. Social networking sites allow terrorist groups to use narrowcasting. Narrowcasting aims messages, pages, etc. At specific segments of the public based on your interests, demographics, age, gender, religion, etc. So if we look at violent extremist groups in Africa and how they use social media, in spite of the massive growth and penetration of internet and connectivity in Africa, we need to keep in mind that only a quarter of Africa has internet coverage, even though cell phone coverage is significantly more. That being said, general literature on the topic identifies about 5 to 6 overlapping categories of ways in which African groups use or exploit new technologies, including social media. So the most obvious there is propaganda, and then we've got financing, training, planning, communication, and to a much lesser extent in Africa, cyber attacks. So mainly in propaganda, we see multimedia messages that provide ideological and even very practical instruction. We see the justification and promotion of violent acts and violent behavior through various virtual magazines, virtual pages on social media itself, audio files, video files. It's so easy to share. It's so easy to disseminate. So social media enables these groups to a certain extent, control the pace and the narrative of the violence that they perpetrate. So when they are removed from one network, because this is something that we regularly see as well, their pages get shut down, their accounts get shut down, like, for example, YouTube and Facebook and Twitter accounts, then the option are always to either set up another account, because one of the best features of social media is that it's so user-friendly. If your grandmother can do it, then anyone can do it. Am I right? So if an account is shut down or removed, then either open up another one or move to another network, something like Telegram, which is highly encrypted. It's not necessarily social media, but it's an encrypted messaging service that can still be used, and it's much more difficult to track and trace and shut down. So one of the most crucial and often overlooked functions of social media and the internet, in that case for violent extremist groups in Africa, is that it serves as a very effective alternative training ground. So when reading pieces on historic fighters of Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, we often come across information of where these fighters trained and with who they trained, and geographic locations. For example, they were trained in Afghanistan with the Taliban in the 90s. And it sounds very impressive, and it immediately gives us a scope into who that fighter is and where they came from. And this is being steadily replaced by things like YouTube and Telegram and other web-based and mobile communications, where you don't need to travel to Afghanistan to get trained anymore. It offers detailed instructions in very accessible multimedia formats on how to construct explosives, firearms, how to plan and execute successful attacks, whether it's in groups, whether it's single attacks. All of those things are now available in the media. You can sit in your kitchen and be trained. Then there's also the well-known examples of live tweeting of attacks, the publishing of videos of messages, sermons, beheading attacks where the narrative is being controlled. So social media, in spite of Africa's weak internet penetration, often is used to remind not only Africans, but also the broader audience internationally of the African jihad taking place, how it is going, and what is happening on the African continent by someone controlling that specific narrative. And then the big part of my question, and I'm actually asking this question, and I don't think that I really have the answer, and I think that as academics, we should really be looking for this answer, that are we overhyping this threat of social media, or are we actively anticipating this threat of social media in Africa? At first sight, it might seem as if the opportunities and possibilities that are presented to violent extremist groups in Africa by social media are endless. It's easy to customize, it's easy to fiddle with, to access, to use, to distribute. It's easy to teach someone how to use. But I can't help to look for another side of the coin. It can't be that all that glitters is gold. So yes, social media and multimedia technology is being used by violent extremist groups in Africa. And yes, there are many advantages to using these platforms. But there are, however, a few things that we need to keep in mind before we label social media as the new forefront. And I think before the cure to fighting violent extremist groups through the media front becomes worse than the disease itself. Before we deem social media as the beginning and ending of terrorism in Africa. So if we look, for example, at Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, and ISIL, they all use social media, yes. They use it to varying degrees and varying levels of sophistication. And it's safe to say that the new will not, in this case, replace the old. And with that, I mean that while these groups use social media to recruit domestically and internationally, online efforts are almost always complemented by offline influences to supplement strategies. In areas in Africa where the internet penetration is low and weak, things like religious leaders, peer pressure, and family, old methods of communication, old methods of recruitment will always have their value. And that is something that as academics we can never discard because of this bright and shiny new thing called social media. So violent extremist groups use social media to boast of attacks, to boost their coverage of attacks if they feel they aren't getting enough international attention of these attacks, like Boko Haram and the kidnapping of the girls in 2014. At the same time, these platforms are also used to critique opponents. So as we've established, many uses, but somewhere along the line, it can come back to bite. All right. So these groups continuously have to shift online activities to new accounts, to more encrypted sites, to be able to continuously use these newfound methods. It is a small thing, and it has been the efficacy of continuously shutting down accounts and continuously simply removing something that is posted by an extremist group has been critiqued. It's a small thing, but I think it is super annoying for these groups to have to continuously shift what they are doing to either more encrypted sites or to new accounts to keep on using these types of platforms. So the value thereof and the effort versus the reward that they are actually getting from it I think we can start to question these types of things as well. So ISIL uses social media to coordinate messaging and military planning. And these same platforms has created, along the same lines, challenges for Al-Shabaab's coordination efforts. The growth and expansion, the ease of access of the internet has led to a loss of control of that narrative that they so desperately need to control for Al-Shabaab leaders, with this online activity booming so much and becoming more and more decentralized. Everyone with a relatively stable internet connection now can create a Twitter account and name it something with Al-Shabaab and claim to be an Al-Shabaab leader and start disseminating messages. And independent, geographically far removed jihadists can either willingly or unwillingly undermine the group's messaging and ideological strategies. Attacks can be claimed and broadcasted independently, while being completely removed from the group's command centers at the same time. The RAND Corporation recently did a Twitter data study where they collected more than 200,000 tweets in 5 years. And the analysis found that the number of tweets that claimed to be from Al-Shabaab actually created a sense of distrust from the audience, where the audience couldn't gauge who was the real Al-Shabaab and who was just tweeting and saying. A sense of uncertainty among the Twitter users about the veracity of the tweets on social media, where in this sense, I think less is actually more within the use of social media. So I think it's an interesting development in this field that was not necessarily anticipated. And there's also indicated that the media-led discussions generated by major attacks are likely to overshadow the more continuous online messaging of terrorist groups in more controlled environments like encrypted messaging forums and online magazines that are more controlled and more centralized. And then to conclude, I think we need to keep in mind, as I mentioned, that the new will never completely replace the old. Africans are not joining terrorist organizations because they have a lot of likes on Facebook. An African terrorist organization is not necessarily more powerful because of the frequency or quality of their YouTube videos. Yes, it does count for something. I'm not disregarding these types of uses. But in Africa, we need to remember that unemployment, poverty, displacement, insecurity, injustice, all of these realities are still being lived in Africa. That the lived realities are still having an effect on the vulnerable youth, more than they might have access to social media sites. They do have a lived reality to their immediate circumstances. So the frontline may have some new add-ons in terms of social media, but I don't think we should lose focus of the main threat while maybe anticipating what these new add-ons may be and what the effects thereof may be. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Grobler, for that insightful presentation. It's really interesting to think about it like that. I want to introduce our second presenter for today, Prof Hussein Solomon, and he's the head of the Department of Political Studies and Governance at the University of the Free State. He's also an extraordinary professor attached to the School of Government Studies at the Northwest University, and is a prolific author and researcher on all topics of terrorism and counterterrorism. It's a real pleasure for us to have him today sharing his insight on his topic of the failure of counterterrorism in Africa. Prof Solomon, you can go ahead. Prof Solomon, you're muted. You made a mistake with that.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, apologies about that. Colleagues, thank you, Professor Pargo, Dr. Prinsloo, and Northwest University for hosting me at this important event. Terrorism is on the rise in Africa, and it points to the failure of counterterrorism measures undertaken by national governments, regional bodies, and the African continent. I want to talk about 6 factors contributing to the failure of counterterrorism responses on the African continent. First, a failure to diagnose the problem adequately. Analysts and policymakers have fundamentally misdiagnosed the challenge of terrorism in Africa, viewing insurgents as part of global jihad, Inc., the local franchises of Islamist extremism. This narrative is appealing in its simplicity. The names of various groups such as Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, and Islamic State West Africa province all suggest that these are local franchises of their global parent bodies. The Islamist rhetoric from both parent body and local franchise is often similar. We'll talk of perpetual conflict between the Dar al-Harb, a place of war where non-Muslims hold sway, and Dar al-Islam, a place of peace where Muslims hold sway. Local jihadists have often benefited from the financial resources and technical know-how from global Islamist organizations. Despite the appeal of this simplistic narrative, to speak of a global war on terrorism in the African context is factually wrong. The real challenges facing Africa today, Stephen Emerson notes, is how to cope with the problem of domestically based terrorism that springs from competing political, economic, and social demands upon fragile societies. In a similar vein, Yaki Saliers has argued that it is imperative to distinguish between sub-state domestic terrorism and international terrorism, and that a failure to distinguish between the two runs the risk of pushing sub-state terrorists into the waiting arms of international terrorists. This is precisely what is happening across the continent. African government officials encourage the myth of external jihadists intruding into the region, as opposed to taking responsibility for the fact that these militant groups have proliferated as a result of their own governance failures, their own authoritarian policies, and the rapacious corruption which has grown endemic across vast expanses of the continent. If one takes Cabo Delgado, citizens there in northern Mozambique have real grievances against Maputo. It is Mozambique's poorest province with a very high unemployment rate and no government services. Muslims feel alienated, ethnic neighbors have access to Frelimo party, and therefore political privileges and economic resources that they do not have. The second point I want to discuss briefly is the failed counterterrorism a result of a failure of early warning? In my view, it's not. Despite talk of a failure of early warning, I find this frankly ridiculous and regard it as more as a failure of early action. Way before the formation of Boko Haram in 2009, there were precedents to Boko Haram's demands, okay? And you can see this in the Matatsine uprisings in Kano in the early 1980s, in 1982 in Kaduna, and Bulumkutu, 1984 in Yola, and 1985 in Bauchi, all represent an effort to impose a religious ideology on a secular Nigerian state, and indeed were forerunners for what was to come afterwards, in much the same way that Boko Haram is attempting to force Abuja to accept Sharia law across 36 states of the Nigerian polity. Between 1999 and 2008, there were 28 religious conflicts which were reported in northern Nigeria, the most prominent, of course, being the recurrent violence between Muslims and Christians in Jos in 2001, 2002, 2004, and 2008. Now, if we turn to Mozambique, in 2004, there were already reports of militant training camps in Mozambique. Between 2010 and 2013, Training camps were identified in Nampula and Tet provinces of Mozambique, run by Somalis, another by Pakistanis, a third by Indians and Bangladeshis. By the early 2000s, some young men break off from the Islamic Council of Mozambique to form Ansaru Sunnah, where they built new mosques, madrasas, and imposed a Salafist form of Islam in areas. In 2015, the group attempts to enforce a ban on alcohol and forcing parents not to send their children to schools to be Western educated. So there are echoes of Boko Haram here in northern Mozambique. 2015 was also the year that the local Muslim community started referring to them as Al-Shabaab, but there was no link to the Somali group. 2015 again was the year that the group stabbed a policeman to death, and the community, the local Muslim community, started calling on the Mozambican government to intervene. All this was early warning, but there was no action. Okay, let me turn to my third point, which is failed counterinsurgency campaigns. Many African armies are simply not prepared to fight insurgents, as they were trying to fight conventional battles. Simply put, 600 troop battalions, which are highly mobile, should be the core of the army, not the bigger brigades of 3,000 troops or a corps of 10,000. Yet it is important to reflect on the experiences of a South African involved in counterinsurgency operations in Nigeria. Recognizing the disorganized, demoralized, and penetrated nature of his own security apparatus, former Nigerian President Goodluck Jonathan hired a private military company, STEP, run by former South African Colonel Eben Barlow in January 2015. Barlow in turn brought an elite task force consisting of 100 veterans of South Africa's border wars of 30 years ago, as well as helicopter pilots flying their own combat missions. Remarkably, these counterinsurgency specialists were in their 50s and 60s. Despite their age, they managed to push Boko Haram back out of several towns in a relatively short time. In February 2015, whilst at the same time allowing for relatively peaceful conditions in northern Nigeria in which to hold an election. How was this accomplished? Recognizing that the Nigerian armed forces were largely using conventional tactics against Boko Haram, specializing in asymmetric warfare, STEP imitated Boko Haram's own guerrilla-style tactics with non-stop assaults, labeled relentless pursuit. Using their own trackers from South Africa's bush wars in Namibia, STEP could tell in which direction the militants were heading, how fast they were going, and from the loads they were carrying, the kind of weapons they had in their possessions. Helicopters would then carry the STEP strike force ahead of the militants. At the same time, gun crews on the helicopters were given kill blocks to the front and flanks of the strike force. Boko Haram was defeated in every one of these engagements with STEP. And the only member of the strike force to have been killed was one person who was killed by friendly fire from a Nigerian tank. The point being made here is that counterinsurgency warfare done right works. Excessive force, however, used in counterinsurgency operations, however, is counterproductive, tending to alienate the local population. In Mozambique, following the local Muslim community's appeal to Maputo to assist them with the militants, forces were not deployed by the Mozambican government, and unfortunately, excessive force was used, treating all Muslims as terrorists, resulting in the local community turning against the military presence. Let me turn to my fourth point, having the wrong people in the wrong places. Closely linked to failed counterinsurgency operations is having the wrong people in the wrong places. During the time of President Touré in Mali, recruitment into the armed forces required a relative at the level of a colonel or a general. Skill sets or the necessary skill sets did not seem to matter. Who you knew seemed to matter more. Under the circumstances, should we be surprised that the Malian armed forces crumbled so spectacularly in 2012 at the start of the Tuareg Islamist insurgency? There are lessons that we should take to heart in South Africa if one looks at the revelations of the Zondo Commission. Our security forces cannot be politicized or have criminal elements within it if we intend to successfully prosecute counterterrorism operations in all of its facets. Let me turn to my fifth point: failed African regional security organizations. If one accepts the AU's peace and security framework, the regional economic communities are supposed to be at the bedrock of the continent's security framework. Yet these have proved to be an abject failure. The much vaunted African Standby Force has proven to be a paper tiger. Increasingly, it is ad hoc arrangements, which is becoming the norm. In the Sahel, it is the Sahel G5, working in close relationship with the French Operation Barkhane troops and with the support of the US. In the case of Somalia, it is not IGAD, but AMISOM. And AMISOM has a strong extra-regional component, including 850 soldiers from Sierra Leone and a Nigerian police detachment. In the case of Mozambique, it was Russian and regional private military contractors, and now US Green Berets and the Portuguese. Unfortunately, we still await a credible response from SADC. Let me turn to my sixth point: failed international responses. The predatory nature of the African state hardly occupies the minds of policymakers in London, Paris, or Washington. This is unforgivable given the vast literature on the subject. In the process, Western states in particular continue to treat their African counterparts as merely weaker versions of themselves. The emphasis is on capacity building. The training of African militaries continued apace. Consider here the case of Mali's Captain Sanogo, Amadou Sanogo. He received extensive military training in the US between 2004 and 2010, and upon returning to his country, he promptly staged a coup against the Malian government. I won't even talk about the current situation in Mali. Given the rapacious nature of African militaries, there's a real danger that military skills imparted by Western countries may well make a predatory African state even more predatory, with newfound military skills and new military equipment complements of a rather naive West. In the process, African citizens may turn to Islamists in droves to protect them from a rapacious state. This danger was recognized by former US Ambassador Prinsloo Lyman when he warned the United States has to be especially careful that we do not become partners in a political process that drives people into the arms of Islamic extremists. Foreign intervention also fails, since counterterrorism is often secondary to national self-interest. Consider here the case of French intervention in the Sahel. 75% of France's electricity is produced by nuclear power plants. Areva is a French parastatal, which is 80% state-owned. Areva's twin mining operations at Alit and Agadez in Niger is Areva's second largest source of uranium. The need to protect French energy interests was highlighted in a terrorist attack in May 2013 on the Alit and Agadez's uranium mines. French President Emmanuel Macron also made clear that the need to stabilize the region was essential if Europe intends to curb the influx of migrants. Short-term foreign national interests may well undermine the longer-term goal of engaging in structural reforms, both governance and economic development, in an effort to minimize terrorism on this continent. So my conclusion, colleagues, thank you so much for taking the time to hear my brief thoughts on the subject. I look forward to your engagement on the points raised. Thank you.
This is not too much.
Thank you, Professor Solomon. That was very enlightening. Can I just ask that everybody switch off the microphones, please? We're having some feedback. Marcellus, can you switch off your microphone, please? Thank you. Okay, we are doing very well in time. Speakers are keeping within their 15 to 20 minutes. I'm really happy about that. Our third speaker, who I want to introduce now, is all the way from California in the United States of America. Prof J. Holmes Armstead is a retired professor of strategy in international law from the United States Naval War College. Prof Armstead received his JD in 1975 from DePaul University and was awarded a PhD in public policy analysis from Pacific Western University in 1981. Prof Armstead is also the recipient of 3 honorary doctorates. It is a real honor to have such a distinguished scholar at this colloquium, and we are looking forward to his presentation on the United States' need for a rapid counterterrorism response capability in SADC. Thank you so much, Prof Armstead. You may go ahead with your presentation.
Professor Prinsloo, thank you very much for your introduction. I wish you hadn't put the years in, because clearly now people realize just how old I am. I thought I might be able to get away with that. And Professor Fago, thank you very much also for implementing the invitation. Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. And I say that with some degree of humor, because when I started, it was yesterday. For me, this is a 2-day conference. We started on the 25th because of the time difference, but good morning nonetheless. It's a pleasure being here with you for a number of reasons. And in some ways, I'm more of an audience member than I am a participant in this august body of experts. You see, I'm not an expert in either terrorism or in African security issues. I'm not an expert in either one of those things. So we should know that. There's a famous American fictional character, for those of you who like Western movies, Captain Nathan Brittles, who was an old cavalry officer. He was in the John Ford trilogy that deals with the Indian Wars in America, the old cavalry, 40 years. He was an expert at training lieutenants, and he had a number of rules. And his first rules in training lieutenants is he told them never to apologize. It makes you look weak. Well, I'm going to violate that. I do apologize. As I say, I'm not a terrorism expert. I'm not an expert on African security. But let me tell you what I do know. I teach, as Professor Prinsloo said, international law, and I'm a specialist in national security affairs and focusing on defense policy and strategy. And I want to talk to you today a bit about the position of the United States. I'm I guess the only US scholar who's with you, and what I have to bring, I think, is perspective. It was Goethe, Johann von Goethe, no less an authority, who tells us that foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. Well, I will tell you, in Washington, I've worked there on a number of occasions as a military officer, as a strategist, and as a politician working for a member of Congress as a chief of staff. There are a lot of little minds in Washington, but there's not foolish consistency. There is inconsistency in our policy, inconsistency in our relationship with our allies, and just about every other area you can maintain in terms of policy, there is inconsistency. But we do have a system, a general system under which we work, which I would like to talk about. Now, that system has overall policy goals. And I will just mention a couple of things. Collective security, which we called initially collective defense, which is what I want to talk with you about this morning, primarily. We believe in a rule-based international order. We believe in an organizational and structural response to solve problems as a group. That is, organizations like NATO, like the EU, like the United Nations, that we do feel that is the best response to international problems. We believe in economic expansion. We believe in the growth of and equity of distribution of resources and goods, and of course, democracy and stability. That's the overarching view that we have, and that continues across administrations and has been true for some time. It strikes me as I listen to the experts who've already talked and those who are about to, that my interest in terrorism as a strategist and South Africa actually go hand in hand. You see, the week before the 9/11 attacks, and that's when terrorism first came on the scene in America as a serious strategic issue. I was in South Africa. I had been there for several weeks. I was the keynote speaker for the South African Bar Association in late August of 2001. And then I went on to the South African Military Academy, where I talked about international law. Questions came up about terrorism, and my remarks at the time were that all of Africa, not just South Africa, but all of Africa needed to concern itself with coordinating national policy and vis-a-vis transnational problems in terms of strategy, and particularly in terms of terrorism, because you can't have a national policy which allowed terrorists to cross a border and hide. If they act transnationally, then the African nations at the time, and certainly the 53 nations on the continent now, need to cooperate and work on these kinds of issues in two ways. First, as a police matter, that is, as a national legal matter, and then, of course, as an international strategic matter. And the third thing I recommended was there should be some sort of international or transnational court, perhaps at the AU, that dealt with war crimes, that dealt with piracy, and that dealt with humanitarian law. Well, I suppose that, speaking of foolish consistencies, I could take all of those things that I recommended in August and September of 2001. I've been saying those since then, and I think they're relevant today. They're just as relevant today as they were 20 years ago, and things that we should consider. But on to my major thesis for today, and that is the United States, since 1948, since essentially the end of the Second World War, has looked upon the world. Its worldview is the concept of collective security is absolutely fundamental to how we want to defend ourselves. It's what we've done since the end of the Second World War. As the Cold War was starting, 1948, NATO, which was promulgated by President Truman, was a coalescing of the allies from the Second World War together to form a permanent military organization. Now, this had not happened before in peacetime. This is something new in history. In the First World War, it took 2.5 years before the Allies decided that the first principle of war, unity of command, was something that was absolutely necessary to prosecute the war against Germany. So, and eventually Marshal Foch was appointed as the Supreme Allied Commander. Although he did not have actual command authority over Allied troops, there was a coordinating committee, if you will, that prosecuted the war that came together. But it took essentially 2.5 years of defeat and terrible losses for the Allies to realize this. Now, we all get a little smarter over time. In the Second World War, of course, the United States is attacked on December 7th, 1941. Immediately, Prime Minister Churchill flew to America. He arrived in Washington the 11th of December, and by Christmas, he stayed over Christmas. By Christmas, a joint command structure had been set up, a joint staff, a joint American-British staff. Lord Ironside, General Marshall were the coordinators of this, each the head of their respective defense establishments. And that's how we decided to prosecute the war from the very beginning. So one of the 8 principles of war, this unity of command, was clear and focused from the very beginning. Well, once the war is over, of course, the pressure to do this sorts of thing, this goes away. We don't continue to have that kind of pressure. Well, it was realized by the military authorities of the various Allied nations at the time that we were going into a position of Cold War with the Russians. We weren't getting along with the Soviet Union. There were disagreements over how Germany should be administrated. The joint commissions of French, British, American, Russian were not freely allowing people to go back and forth. The promised elections were not taking place. all of those sorts of things. And the concept of collective security was promulgated essentially by two people, John Foster Dulles and his younger brother, Alan. Well, John Foster Dulles had been the Assistant Secretary of State during the Second World War for European affairs. So he had worked on issues that related to what was going to happen at the end of the war, how we were going to bring democracy back to those nations that had been subjugated. And his younger brother, Alan Dulles, these are both lawyers, I would offer. And let me apologize for being a lawyer myself. And even worse, I'm the son of a lawyer. My father also was a lawyer. Now, these lawyers did things by the word. They were practicing lawyers. They knew President Roosevelt, and they both came into in and out of government over several administrations. But they were partially responsible for putting some of these ideas together. John Foster Dulles became the Secretary of State under Eisenhower, and not only did he follow suit on making NATO stronger, but he also promulgated an interlocking set of defense structures around the world. So NATO, of course, in Europe, CENTO in the Middle East and the Levant, and CETO in the Far East. It was an attempt to essentially box in the Soviet Union. Our foreign policy, rather simple. You could stop a 10-year-old boy on a bicycle in Kansas City and ask him in 1955, what was the foreign policy of the United States? And rather easily he could respond, sir, it is containment. We want to contain the Soviet Union. So collective defense was a response to this massive threat that was seen at the time, how we would deal with this massive threat. We needed a coordination of nations. It needed to happen in peacetime with a commitment to defense, with a commitment to an active and focused, developed military structure. I would offer the crux of Article 5 in the NATO treaty, an attack upon one is an attack upon all, was the binding force which held this together. That really meant the defense of a group of nations, the collective defense. And we've gone forward, we'll now call that collective security. But the original concept, collective defense, that was held together by Article 5. Now, what does this mean in terms of our foreign policy going forward, and how does this relate to terrorism in Africa? Well, of the 53 nations in Africa, the United States has agreements with 38. Now, those agreements, which are bilateral, they're very different. It depends upon what a nation wants, what it needs. In the last several weeks, we've conducted an exercise called Lion 21. And it deals with 12 nations. We look at, with active forces, we look at airfields that can be used in case of a military circumstance. There's a military requirement to move troops into Africa, to move troops between various countries. How would those countries cooperate? How could American air power be used to support them? And we've been working on that. As I say, 12 nations have been involved in, it's a very large-scale exercise. It's worked very well. Now, I want to talk for just a moment about the structure in which this works, how it operates. That at the Department of Defense, of course, is where our military forces are. The Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps in 1987 under the Goldwater-Nichols Defense Reorganization Act, received a new doctrinal guide where we were to organize ourselves to fight jointly and combine. That is, we would have unified commands around the world with area responsibilities for specific regions of the world, and all of the forces would come under, American forces, come under a single commander who would command our maritime, air, and land forces. So that makes them combined. I'm sorry, that makes them joint. They are combined in the sense that they are directly responsible from the Secretary of Defense. So the President is Commander-in-Chief, the Secretary of Defense relaying those orders directly to these combatant commanders around the world. There are 11 of these commands that you should be aware of. The commands that are related to subject matter, the subject matter commands, of which there are 5. The Space Command, which is rather obvious what they do. They concern themselves with defense from and to outer space, from attacks that could possibly come from outer space, and the use of space as a defensive parameter. The Transcom, US Transcom, Worldwide Command, it concerns itself with transportation. So these are naval resources, these are maritime civil resources, these are air resources, both military and civil, that can move troops, supplies, resources that are necessary anywhere in the world if that's where a response needs to be made. The Special Operations Command, which of course it's involved in Africa now. This is all of the special operators from each of the armed services which come under a unified commander. And of course the Cyber Command, which deals with cyber warfare issues, and it supports all of the regional commands around the world. So those, and Strategic Command, which deals with forces that look at organizing, training, maintaining our force structure, and new changes, how we save money, how we develop doctrine, what we can do to modernize on a continuous basis. The 6 area commands as follows. Of course, European Command, under which all of the forces we give to NATO, which is in Stuttgart, that's where the command headquarters is. CENTCOM, which is MacDill Air Force Base in Florida, deals with the Middle East and the Levant. The Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii covers the 49 nations of the Pacific, plus Southeast Asia. And the Southern Command, which covers South America, Central America, Northern Command, all of North America, and finally AFRICOM, the newest of these Joint and Unified Commands, which is also in Stuttgart, covers the area of Africa. So all of the things that we do are related through that. If I can give you the mission of AFRICOM, that is to support and maintain armed forces that will give aid, tactical and strategic, to African countries to make them stronger in self-defense and to increase their resource base and allow them to defend themselves better. And of course, terrorism becomes involved in that sort of thing. Now, as I said, there are 38 of the 53 African nations have agreements to work with AFRICOM. The AFRICOM is, it's commanded by General Steve Townsend, an Army general with extensive experience in Africa. He's been in AFRICOM as a subordinate commander before. He has a military deputy commander who is an Air Force officer, Steve Nix, and who is a former special operations officer, an extensive experience commanding various Air Force special operations unit throughout his career. But of more interest perhaps to you is that there is a deputy to the commander at the ambassadorial level, and that's Ambassador Andrew Young, former ambassador to Burkina Faso, with lots of experience, 30 years in the diplomatic corps, who is specifically designated to advise the commanding general, General Townsend, on issues dealing with civil military relations within the states that we work with in Africa, and of course, conducting diplomatic discussions as to how we can better integrate ourselves with our African allies. Now, our belief, as I said, overarching belief in collective security focuses us on looking at not only how we deal bilaterally with a specific nation having a problem, for example, a terrorist problem, where we may use conventional resources, that is the Army Command, the Navy Command, underneath the Joint and Unified Command in Stuttgart, AFRICOM, or the special operators that may be called on from the Special Operations Command at MacDill Air Base in Florida, who would be assigned as assets to AFRICOM for specific missions. For example, 200 special operators from the Army were recently assigned to Mozambique to work on specific terrorist-related problems that are there. Now, that's the structure in which we work on. Let me say a little bit about terrorism and how we look at it. Terrorism, it came onto our radar September 11th, 2001. That's when it came onto our radar. It was there. We recognized that we had assets that dealt with it, but we hadn't made up our minds strategically what we were going to do about it. And there are a couple of models that could be maintained here. We decided upon a war on terrorism. We call it GLOT, the Global War on Terrorism. I would argue, and I did at the time, that was a mistake. The name was a mistake. When the Japanese attacked the United States, December 7th, 1941, we did not declare war upon Sunday morning attacks. A Sunday morning attack is a tactic. Terrorism is a tactic. It's not a strategy. The strategy, the overall strategy, asymmetric warfare, is to destabilize a government. It's to use your propaganda to make citizens distrustful of their particular nation. It's to create enough of consternation, tension, instability within a country so a small force can exercise its political will. Well, I would argue this is violative of our belief in democracy. It is violative of the political rights of the individuals in a particular country. And of course, it attacks directly the values we have of free expression, involvement with the government, self-government of the citizens of a particular state by a small group exercising terror violence, in the words of Professor Robert Friedlander back in the early 80s, who coined the term terror violence. Bob Friedlander talked about the inability of governments to respond to various small threats because they looked at the world in a strategic sense. And boy, is that the case. It's certainly what we saw at 9/11, and in some cases, what we see now. So I wish we had a better term. War should be made on terrorists, not on terrorism. Terrorism is a tactic. The terrorists are people making war. It's asymmetrical war, and larger nations tend to respond with what they have, the tools that they have. So the United States, for example, immediately responded with its military. Now, if we look at, I lived in London, I was teaching at the University of London when the Irish Republican Army realized that if you attack 3 subway stations at the same time, dispersed throughout London, it shut the entire subway down. And of course, to my consternation, and I thought this was directed at me personally, they would do this in morning rush hour so I couldn't get to my classes on time at the University of London at Richmond College. Now, the response of the British government to these terrorist attacks was to use their civilian police forces and other civil authority to go after the terrorists. So first, intelligence would be gathered, then criminal jurisdiction would be exercised where crimes were committed, and then prosecution of the particular individuals captured would be made. The army, the military forces, would be used to assist where they had resources that were useful. So for example, intelligence assets, technical intelligence, signals intelligence would be used by the military. If in fact a large group of terrorists were going to be seized and one needed to engage in some sort of a forceful entry into a closed area, then the military could be used to support the police. But it was primarily a police action with military support. Fighting terrorism by the United States for the last 20 years has been primarily a military action supported by police and other civil authorities, the FBI in terms of their criminal jurisdiction, the CIA in terms of intelligence gathering, and the other 16 agencies we have, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, and so forth. So we have come together as strategically looking at terrorism, and we use the weapons we have, which are large-scale conventional military. Now, Afghanistan and Iraq have forced us to change exactly how that's done. So what we have done with our military, with our special operators, we've given them, in some ways, more police-like operational modalities, where small groups or where they're useful, or or agents of the terrorist are turned by getting people on the inside, creating double agents. So much like a police operation going after, for example, felons in the drug trade. So we've started to do that. We call this the coin doctrine. So we use propaganda. We try to undo the propaganda of the terrorists so that we can change the minds of people who are involved. We had a wonderful presentation about the use of social media and how that is used to get people, first of all, recruited and then, of course, trained. Well, that can be turned against them because those same people are aware of information from other sources. Since there are no assigned journalists from the point of view of the terrorist, there are no assigned editors. There's not that balanced reporting that we require from the old traditional media, where a reporter had to have three sources, otherwise an editor would not print a spurious allegation against someone. So those sorts of things don't exist in this new world, this brave new world that we're now in. And the very public media access that causes us the problems, that allows for this spread of information in an uncontrolled fashion and helps foster terrorism, can also be used against the terrorists. That information from the government, from the institutions of civil authority, from the entire civil society itself, hopefully can be used to bring people back into an understanding that government is there for them. Now, the government has to be good government. Ronald Reagan used to say, good politics is good government. So if you ran the government well, that was very good policy, good politics to help you get reelected, and the sort of things we need to do. Well, I only have 20 minutes. I have a few more things here, but let me wrap up by saying that we need to look at, in terms of the United States, we need to look at dealing with our allies in Africa, as well as other places, better intelligence, coordination of counterintelligence, the actions, covert actions in Afghanistan, which have been relatively successful and much more successful even in Iraq, must be continued. Where they're stopped, of course, the terrorists come back. They fill a vacuum. Homeland security and our international defense policy have to be coordinated better together. We're not doing that as well as we possibly could, I would argue, and certainly prosecution of criminals and the use of our legal justice system, where that's appropriate for the type of misbehavior the terrorists may commit, should be done in coordination with military activity, where the asymmetrical warfare has risen to a level where military response needs to be made. The Defense Department, in our case, as well as our civil authorities, needs to work much closer with the civil authorities in the African states who are dealing with terrorism. And hopefully that's the sort of thing that's going to happen. I hope that's been useful for you, giving you the perspective of the United States, where we come from strategically and how we are addressing the problem in a rather general fashion. And we could talk about in the Q&A perhaps some more specifics that would be useful to you. But thank you very much for inviting me, and I hope that has had some value for you.
Thank you very much, Prof Armstead, for that presentation. We are going to go
in
on
20 minutes, Dr. Prinsloo.
It was done a little bit in overtime, but that's fine. Thank you so much. Our next and final speaker for today, before we start with the question and answering session, is Dr. Piet Kroukamp. Dr. Piet Kroukamp teaches research methods and international relations theory at the Northwest University. He's a bit of a celebrity in South Africa. He's very well known and a respected speaker on political matters. We are very happy to have him here. He will do a presentation a little bit more closer to home on South Africa's response, probably included, as he focused on the informalization on the coercive apparatus of the state. And he will be focusing specifically on South Africa's civilian intelligence capabilities over the past few years. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Dr. Kroukamp.
Can I ask you, do you see my presentation there?
Yes, I do.
Okay, I just want to take issue, I think, with, let me just tell you this, I'm not an expert in terrorism, and I'm not really an expert on state security either. So I will cowardly try to drag the topic in the direction where I feel comfortable with, and that is, I will to a certain degree take issue with what we are talking about, and that is terrorism, in the sense that I think, and if I've listened to the speakers today, it supports to some extent my argument, and that is that I wouldn't use the word terrorism lightly, because I think that a particular phenomenon, as you experience, say, for instance, in Mozambique, and one that you see in Afghanistan, or what you see in South America, all those, or many of them, could be referred to as terrorism. And I'm sure it will be referred to as terrorism by the state in the geography where it takes place. But if you include crime, and if you include human trafficking, and if you include drug trade or drug smuggling, are all these phenomena exactly the same thing? Does it deserve to be called terrorism? When is something terrorism? When you employ your full army to fight a particular phenomenon, or when you go after, say, ISIS in Nigeria, such as the executive outcomes remnants have done? What exactly is terrorism? And I think I'm concerned about it, because I think we tend to use concepts which has little explanatory value. The idea of acting on something is that you must understand it well, and you can only understand it if the concepts that you are using and the operationalization of that concept is consistent with a universal understanding of exactly what happens. And I think I'm really concerned about the way we deal sometimes with concepts lightly. In South Africa, we do exactly the same thing. We are now in an era where state capture is the buzzword, is the keyword. We're trying to explain what happens to governance in South Africa in terms of state capture, or the economy in terms of state capture, state-societal relations in terms of state capture. It's as if we are infatuated with one single feature of something, trying to explain everything with that particular concept until it's familiar. So the president announced in 2018, he appointed a new panel to investigate state security, the state security agency in South Africa. And it's because he was concerned about the activities on the inside. He was concerned, I think, about early signs of corruption. And he was concerned about the extent to which this particular state agency could have been involved in activities within civil society or within the political domain, within the political sphere, that is beyond its constitutional, let me just see if I can get that wrong. Okay, that is beyond its constitutional realm. In other words, prescription of what it should be doing. So I think the question was that the panel asked themselves, what exactly went wrong? And they agreed to a certain degree with the intentions of the president when he appointed the committee or the investigation. Was there was a degree of politicization, sorry for my stumbling there. In other words, it was possible that the intelligence community was involved in the already factional divisions within the African National Congress, within the governing party. And there was a clear sign to some people that President Zuma at the time might have used the intelligence structures of the state against his opponents within the governing party. It could also have been that these structures got involved on their own volition. In other words, they had a particular interest to become involved. In other words, it could have been that they have tried to settle some of the differences in the scores within the ruling party, because in some other way, this relationship with the master patron, in other words, the president, the executive, had a particular importance to them. And that has led to what they refer to as a doctrinal shift. In other words, there was a deviation from the prescriptions of the Constitution of what exactly is the purpose, the function, and how state security should behave in a democracy, in a liberal democracy. And I think that has to do something, it also relates to the idea of the amalgamation of national intelligence and the South African Secret Service at the time, but that's besides the point. But I think the more important thing for me was there was an argument that there's a type of secrecy, and one would assume that state security is about secrecy, but there was a type of secrecy there which was deliberately aimed in stifling accountability. Because even the Secret Service in South Africa, even state security, is supposed to at least adhere to the constitutional prescriptions about accountability. They must report to Parliament, for instance. There must be a specific process according to which people are appointed. The executive is, in terms of very specific rules and regulations, involved in the process of appointing people within the state security. And then, of course, there was the idea of resource abuse. So the implication of all this, and this high-level review panel report, the implication of the above findings of this report is that the operational practices have been readjusted to serve personal interest and determine outcomes of contest and contestation within a specific political realm, which was the governing party. And that is one thing one would assume that the state security is not involved in. Remember, like the bureaucracy, or like many other state institutions, constitutionally prescribed institutions, the jurisdiction of these institutions are prescribed in the Constitution, are determined by policy and legislation, and should be protected. That's how it operates in the liberal democratic system. Once these institutions start involving themselves in the conflicts or the contestation within society for political authority, political office, then exactly that's the point where the Constitution is bypassed, if I can use the word. The resources of the state and the state security agency is utilized to impact the power struggles between political elites. Okay, so the first thing that people will call this is that it's just plain and mere corruption. They use the state funds, they distort financial best practice within the state security agency, either within an institution, individual theft, or between individuals inside the institution, or entrepreneurs even in the private sector. In this particular case, there were individuals involved. People were appointed from the outside without them necessarily becoming part of the organogram of the institution, and they were rewarded according to this. So the sole aim of this type of corruption, one could say, is a form of a benefit that some people get, but it's also aimed at enrichment. So, but that is something very, very different from state capture. State capture could be corruption, but it's not always corruption. And Ivar Chipkin made a presentation to the Zondo Commission, and he explained the notion of state capture. But I think Ivar, for all the things that he said that was right, I think he made a mistake by arguing the point as if everything that we see that has happened since 2009 under the Zuma regime relates to the idea of state capture. It's almost as if everything that ever happened was state capture. He made no provision for the likeliness that some of the things, like for instance, what has happened at state security, and that might not have been state capture. That could have been something else. It's not state capture, and it probably also not only corruption. It includes some corruption, but it's not corruption, it's not only corruption, and it's certainly not state capture. So state capture is when governance favors preferential access rather than the greater good. In other words, if certain actors, and usually these actors come from either the economy or society, they in some other way seek to gain advantage over competitors within the economy, within society. And the best way to do it is to latch on to individuals within the state, preferably onto individuals within the executive, where the maximum authority is. But it's also possible that they can seek to influence or build relations with bureaucrats, for instance. But it's not only the aim to seek influence. Quite often, what they do is they seek to get access to these institutions to start managing the extractive regime, the bureaucratic, the managerial regime, and more importantly, the distributive regime. So if you use the example of SARS, for instance, there the aim was, and I think there's enough to, if one look at the various committees and investigations into this, there the aim was to get some form of control over the extractive regime of the state. Tomoyani was appointed there, had a very close relationship with the Guptas. So the Guptas got access to the state's extractive regime. The way the taxes was allocated, the taxes was extracted from the economy, preferential access in terms of how tax process and procedures was conformed to. They have gained access to that particular institution, and thereafter they have managed to impact on the policy decisions within the institution. So the institution was captured by forces within civil society and in the economy of the case of the Guptas, but they used that authority that they got within SARS to give them a specific competitive edge over competitors within the economy. It was hard to compete with the Guptas for a tender, for instance, or for any services rendered to the state, because they have preferential access when they start to impact on policy, and they capture the institution which distribute the surpluses of the state or the budget of the state. Such relations could be corrupt, but are not per definition corrupt. The influence, for instance, of lobby groups is something similar to state capture. The lobby groups aim to influence policy decisions, and sometimes those policy decisions could serve sectarian interests. And for our American guests, I specifically use this example, such as the National Rifle Association in the United States of America. It is often argued that the type of preferential access that they get to policymakers gives them an advantage within society, but more importantly, it does allow them to influence policy. And that can have consequences for the distributive regime of the state, for the extractive regime of the state, for the managerial regime of the state. It gives them access to state. So and that is not illegal, it's perfectly legal. And the same thing happened in South Africa. Some forms of state capture, some forms of involvement within the state could happen perfectly legal. It does not mean that it supports the notion of the greater good and equal access. All those things are undermined, and we refer to it as the values of the Constitution. Quite often these things undermine the values of the Constitution, but it's almost impossible to put those people in jail or to charge them to appear in court, because there's nothing really illegal happening. It's just a form of preferential access that they gain by capturing certain institutions, or at least the policy processes in those institutions. The aims of this of state capture is varied, is to impact policy, is to gain preferential access to the distributive regime, to manipulate the extractive regime. The main aim, however, is for societal and economic actors to gain authority over state institutions. The preferred policy avenue is to enter in South Africa, is the more contentious point, is through empowerment. Empowerment, to call it by name, Black economic empowerment policies are specifically aimed to promote preferential access. And there's a good justification, there's even a moral justification for preferential access. There's a heuristic justification. It's set in law, and those laws, and we had judgments by the Constitutional Court that says, yes, these are justifiable, call it discrimination if you wish. It's justifiable in terms of historical redress. But for the purpose of state capture, it does give preferential access to the state to particular demographic cohorts in society. And if it stays or remains like that in terms of the law, then of course, again, there's nothing illegal about it. So state capture could be legal in many, many ways. The other thing that one could call state capture is, and we had in South Africa, we have what we call a one-party dominant state. In other words, the likeliness of the ANC being elected for another 10, 20 years into government, and had been elected for 27 years into government. The government, or the ANC, seeks to occupy the state through, say, cadre deployment, through empowerment, through the notion that the state has to employ people that actually are loyal to the policy programs of the governing party. That whole value system that is typical of political parties is then elevated to a next level, and the ANC becomes the state. The governing party becomes the state. So that is a form of state capture. It's not illegal. The president has enormous rights to appoint from the ministers right down to bureaucrats, is within the juristic realm of the president to appoint those people. And that to a certain degree also allows for a form of state capture, because the president of the ANC and the president of the country is exactly the same person, and he's got constitutional and legal obligations and responsibilities and prescriptions to make those appointments, and in that way elevate the policy programs of the governing party right into the state. And that's a form of state capture. So if you will hear, for instance, the National Executive Committee of the ANC has decided that there must be appropriation without compensation. It is an extra parliamentary institution that has made a particular policy that will now filter right through all the institutions, constitutionally prescribed institutions, right to the executive, and it might even become law, and it might be sanctioned by the Constitutional Court. So policy decisions could be made somewhere else, and that form of that relationship between the political party and the state is then also a form of state capture. But for state capture, the nature of relations to state capture is it's a balance of forces at least, but it could also be coercive in nature. The master patron in the executive intrudes via external arrangements on the constitutionally prescribed domain of the bureaucrats and appointees. It's external to a certain degree because it comes from the outside, it comes from the economy, it comes from civil society. All the actors that capture the state comes from the outside. Even if it's the ANC as a political party, it's an external force. The ANC, like Malaysian Baker likes to say, is a private institution, it's a private organization. If it is allowed, or if it could, in a legal way, exert the type of pressure on the South African policy process, which can change the constitution. We can change the constitution to make expropriation without compensation. We can make it part of the constitutional realm. If you do that, if a private individual has that access, it comes from the outside. All state capture emanates from either society or the economy, and it compromises managers and bureaucrats and the accounting system, but it might not necessarily be corrupt. If we change the constitution tomorrow to make provision for the expropriation without compensation, it originated within society, it originated within the ruling party, but there's nothing illegal about it. And some people may argue it even serves the greater good. But what I think what is happening at state security, and that's where I deviate a little bit from what Ivor Chipkin has argued, is that, and I think it's a term that was first mooted by people like Apter, Beard, Moore, and Sanders, which I list there. What they refer to is the informalization of the state. So in the state security system, or the investigation by this high panel report, it was obviously clear that the relationship that is established are all relationships of trust. In state capture, it's a balance of forces. It's agreements to serve mutual interests as opposed to the greater good, the interest of the greater good. But the connective tissue of the relationship within the state security, and also when they establish relationships outside, because remember now it's turned around. With state capture, the relationship comes from the outside into the state. What happened at state security is the relationship was concocted on the inside, and then it was linked with societal interests outside. The president and state security had a relationship of trust, and the type of relationships that the state security had to go in had to be those of trust. It's a form of large-scale maintenance of patronage. It's at the level of institutional behavior. It's not only individuals, it is institutional behavior. There's a relationship developing between state security and the executive, between state security and individuals and institutions on the outside. But the dynamics is that nobody from the outside has gained access to state security or the relationship between state security and the executive and could determine or influence that in any way. The force to change, the force to influence comes from within state security to the outside. And that's a very, very different dynamics. And if you think about the likeliness that state security can get involved, say, for instance, in elections in Botswana, it now becomes a reality. State capture doesn't explain that, but the informalization of the state does explain when state security get itself involved in elections in Botswana, in the same way that one can assume that the Russians got themselves involved in the elections in the United States of America. The dynamics come from a particular institution and is spread outwards. It's a form of clientelism, and I don't want you to think about dependency theory, but clients are the outsiders, and they are determined and selected by bureaucrat elites who are the insiders. The aim is to maintain a web-like structure of opportunistic relations between state and society to support and maintain authority dispersed beyond the realm of the state. In other words, state security seek to control authoritative structures within society. They would seek to control the radical economic transformation structure. They would seek to control the Jacob Zuma regime. They would seek to control those structures who oppose the benefits of the relationship of informalization that they've established. And that is why I think this thing could reach beyond borders. Just lastly, this is just a summary of what I've said before. I think the important thing is that we must be careful to use concepts to explain phenomena as if they're all the same. Not all activities that we associate with the broad operational definition of terrorism are exactly the same. And what has happened in state security is not state capture. And in the media, you will read all the time, and it's often explained. And I heard the president the other say, state capture, the institutions captured, and he talked about state capture in the context of state security. State security was not captured. State security, I think the findings of the report is the authority of state security was informalized. In other words, it was being used for specific purposes beyond the reach, the constitutional reach of the institution. Nobody came from the outside and captured it. The fact that the president or Jacob Zuma might have been involved, and definitely had been involved, according to the report, in manipulating the functioning and the distribution of resources allocated to state security, does not mean it is being captured. Capture comes from beyond the state, from outside the structure of a government. It comes from civil society organizations, and it comes from strong actors within the economy. This was what one could refer to as the informalization of the authority of the coercive apparatus of the state. Thank you. Is there anybody out there?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Krookamp. Thank you for that. I see that you've taken a good approach to try to explain what is happening in South Africa. I think your takeaway is that a weakened state, like we had in a captured state, will much easier allow for terrorist activities to take place also in South Africa.
No. What I said is that the informalization of the authority of the state could be in support of what you will broadly refer to as terrorism. State capture's got nothing to do with terrorism, and it doesn't even support it. In fact, a captured state quite often is strengthened in the sense that it becomes more authoritarian, and it is better arranged. It is stronger to revolt against the type of prejudice which we can refer to as terrorism. It is when the state has informalized its authority, when you get the type of activities where the state itself can involve it in the operational features or functioning of something that happens in other countries. It is possible for state security to get involved in the Botswana elections, for instance, but it's not possible, or it wasn't possible so far, for any institution within society or within the economy. And that's where the state capture contenders come from. Nobody there has actively penetrated state security as far as my definition is concerned. So I'm adamant that the point we have to make is that it's the informalization of the state that led to the likeliness of state security becoming involved in cross-border activities. But state capture itself can never lead to that.
Okay. Well, thank you for that explanation. Thanks, Dr. Krookamp. Okay, everybody, we are going to move on to our session, question and answer session. We have, I think we're going to do it as the speakers have, or presenters have presented in that way. We have, what I want to do is, as the questions have come in, I've sent it to the different presenters. And I would like to start with Dr. Grobelaar. If she can respond, just give a gist of the question that was posed to her. And then if she can give an answer in that respect. And then we will move on to Prof Hussein, and then to Prof Armstead, and to Dr. Krookamp in that manner. Okay, Dr. Grobelaar, if you can just go ahead.
Thank you. I have two questions, and I can definitely answer the questions together if that will be fine. They basically come down to the same answer. And the first one was, do you think that African governments, Nigeria especially, have the capacity to check and counter social media used by Boko Haram, or do they still have to rely on other governments? And then there was quite a long question from Sanet that asked, that also gave some background information on how some countries, some more developed countries, have moved past just shutting down pages, but also using them as a means to gain access to information of violent extremist groups. Info that they share with their followers, and also to how to use IP addresses to then track leaders and find leaders, etc. And then the question came down, and that's where it links with the first question as well. Is it possible for African countries to do the same, to work with internet countries and IT professionals to infiltrate these platforms and to develop strategies to shut down these organizations? So firstly, I will definitely not give myself out as an IT professional. I think one of the pitfalls of being young in my family is that some of the older people would think if you are under a certain age, then you are by default an IT specialist. So sorry for the disappointment. I am definitely not. And also, in terms of counter-terrorism, I won't necessarily say that I'm a specialist there, but it's two very interesting questions, and I can answer them with the same answer. And firstly, I think we need to consider the sheer volume of online content that needs to be dealt with. If we look at every minute, 300,000 tweets are posted every single minute, 300 hours of YouTube content posted every minute, and 500,000 comments posted every minute on Facebook. So that is an insane amount of content that needs to be dealt with. So keep that in mind, and keep in mind the capacity issues that African governments already face with day-to-day governance type issues. So if we now then look at social media platforms themselves, as I claimed my own little disclaimer of not being an IT specialist, social media platforms themselves aren't counter-terrorism platforms. So these platforms themselves want to keep counter-terrorism content from being posted in the first place. So it goes against their community standards and against their laws and rules, if I can put it bluntly. And increasingly so, as this became more and more of an issue, it's been written more and more into their rules and regulations, into their administrative policies. And they have developed various forms of artificial intelligence to prevent initial postings of violent extremist content to be posted. So it tracks accounts, it tracks with the algorithms, it tracks repeat offenders so that people cannot post the same content twice, so that accounts cannot be opened twice or more, repetitive opening of accounts that we have seen. And here we see the possible problem with the idea of states using social media accounts for counterterrorism, where social media accounts wants to prevent content completely from being added to their platforms, where there will be no chance for anyone to use or to view the content, whether you are one of the good guys or one of the bad guys. So counterterrorism efforts would want to use the information where the platforms would want to prevent it from ever seeing the light of day. So there's an opportunity there for a more coordinated effort between social media sites and states to work together. I think in 2018, about 70% of accounts labeled as terrorism accounts or violent extremist accounts were shut down within 8 hours of being opened. Some of them even within 2 hours of being opened on Twitter. So the algorithms and the AI being used there is quite effective for the community standards of social media. And then at the same time, it's not really effective for the counterterrorism if they want to use that information for their own advantage. And then to get to the simple answer of the question, then, is it possible for African countries to use this information? And I would say the possibility is there, yes. But then I would say the possibility is there with private sector involvement. And the African governments already struggling to address the threats without this add-on of social media, without this new threat of social media. Okay.
Sorry, can we just mute all our speakers, please, or Selama word? Thank you.
I think the government's already facing so many challenges that writing into legislation and giving permission to private sectors and non-state actors to, on their behalf, look at and monitor the removal of social and online content and use that if needs be. I think the possibility would only exist in that sphere. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Grobler. Thank you very much for your answer there. We'll move on to the question that was posed to Professor Solomon. Did you get that one, Professor Solomon?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much. I will try to be as brief as possible. So basically, I put out some of the challenges confronting counterterrorism on the African continent. So the point is, what corrective measures can be undertaken? I think first and foremost, you need to have the right people in the right places. You need to professionalize your security services. You need to have people of the highest integrity there. And frankly, I really don't see this happening at the moment. The second thing I would say to you is that, as I pointed out in the case of both in the run-up to the formation of Boko Haram and what's happening in northern Mozambique, you need to get in early. It is easier to resolve a problem at its inception than when a thing blows up. The third issue about counterterrorism, you need to avoid political correctness. And unfortunately, that messes things up. It messes your analysis and so on. The fourth point I would say to you is the point of governance. The most recent Global Terrorism Index is emphatic that governance is the most important factor that determines the size, the longevity, and success of a terrorism group. And it points to the legitimacy of the state, which can undertake coercive measures. So governance is absolutely crucial. And then the final point, which I would like to say, given the centrality of RECs, the regional economic communities, is that sovereignty has to be pooled. Okay, it has to be pooled. The constituent member states will have to surrender some level of sovereignty to regional groupings and so forth. And this is not something that African states really want to do, but there is no alternative. So why is there no alternative to pooling of sovereignty? Because regional security complexes exist, they are a reality, because terrorist groups are increasingly cooperating with each other, and because in a globalizing world, insecurity anywhere is a threat to security everywhere. Thank you very much, Dr. Prinsloo.
You're welcome. Thank you, Professor Solomon. I think then we've got a final question for Professor Armstead. Did you get the one that I've sent to you? You're muted, sir. Professor Armstead, just unmute your.
Actually, I was very articulate there. It's a shame you missed that. It's an interesting question. It's an interesting question that you ask. First of all, I agree with Dr. Krukamp implicitly. If we overdo terrorism, we are not exacting. And as I said in my case in chief, President Bush declared a war on terrorism, that was a loose use of what war is. You don't declare war on a particular tactic. Its war is on someone that does something, some country that does something to you. So that was an inexactitude with the use of what terrorism meant and what it does. Dr. Krukamp's thesis is absolutely correct. If we consider terrorism an attack upon values, upon democracy, upon the ability to have self-government, then if we respond to it in such a way that we destroy, for example, as Dr. Robillard talked about the use of media, if we use the media as a weapon against the terrorist in such a way that we destroy privacy for regular citizens, then in fact they've won by our very response. So we need to be exact in terms of defining what terrorism is. Now, if I can for just a moment, let me put on my prosecutor's hat. Being a former prosecutor, in the common law system, motive is not an element of a crime. Why you committed the crime isn't part of the prima facie elements of the crime. However, Professor Friedlander in the 1980s defined terror violence as the use of violence or the threat of violence to force a political outcome. So if in fact you commit a crime for a political ends, that would be terrorism. If you commit the crime for yourself, that's something very different. We can look back in history. I was thinking of Joseph Karakhashvili, a famous Georgian criminal, robbed trains and banks to help fund the Russian Communist Party. Well, he becomes Stalin, and part of his legend is that he committed these acts in the furtherance of advancing the Bolshevik Party. So was Joseph Saakashvili, was he a bank robber, train robber? Was he Jesse James? Or was he the great revolutionary that made it possible for Lenin to come to power by funding the needs of the Bolshevik Party to move ahead in a revolution? So I think you have to ask that question, and Dr. Krukamp is absolutely right. One has to be specific, and we need a definition of what is a crime that's part of terrorism and what is a crime that's it's just a crime. It's not. And I think we can make that distinction, but it should be made. He's absolutely right. I would agree with that.
Thank you, Professor Armstead. We have a question here posed to the panel in itself. I think you can read it there. I will read it too. The person is asking, what role can financial institutes play? And I suppose those are the type of the financial intelligence centers around the world, but also probably the normal banks and so forth. What role can financial institutes play in countering money laundering, which may also contribute to terrorism. I don't know who wants to pick up that question from the panel.
Could I respond, Dr. Prinsloo?
You're very welcome.
Very briefly, banks have been playing a major role, and they do actually have an important role to actually play in this, because without money, there can be no terrorism. You know, finances is the oxygen of terrorism, whether you want to buy weapons or for whatever other reason that you need it for, to pay your fighters and so on. But at the same time, what is problematic on the African continent is that people are bypassing banks and so on. So what you find is illicit activities by terror groups, such as taxation on illegal fishing and mining, to ivory smuggling, where amounts as high as $300,000 are paid for 100 kilograms of ivory. So these illicit activities bypass this. And so this also has to be looked at very, very carefully. I am not an economist, but I think that's part of the problem when you talk about cryptocurrencies and all of these issues as well. So I think that states need to look at this, banks need to do this, but states can't do it on their own. Financial institutions need to play an important role, and of course they are playing this role. Indeed, what's happening, you know, to go back to Dr. Kokam's point, I mean, this is why we are also even looking at the funding of political parties in this country and so forth. So there needs to be greater transparency, but we also need to acknowledge that there's a lot of these financial transactions which is not going through formal institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof Solomon. Anybody else that wants to? Professor Armstead?
Yes, I'd like to make a comment on that. I think that the international monetary system has become very, very interested in money laundering for all kinds of reasons. Clearly, money laundering fosters international crime, transnational crime, the selling of drugs across borders. That's part of this. Now, also, when we look at the recently in my country, we've had an attack upon our energy system. The pipeline was stopped on the East Coast, and payment was made with electronic currency, which I have all sorts of problems as a former prosecutor with electronic currency that can't be traced as dangerous. Money itself, money is a good thing. I'm a capitalist. I'm not a communist. Money is good. However, the use of money to create criminal responsibility, to use it as a threat to the stability of a government, or to deprive someone legitimately of something they own, that's a crime. Where the crime is committed to foster the use of force or the threat of force through the use of money, buying weapons, for example, bribing officials for political purposes, now you're getting into terrorism. I wrote 2 of the 4 crimes at the ICC. And about 20 years ago, just before I retired from the government, I was asked to come back to the UN to work on a 5th crime. They were looking at creating a crime of terrorism. Terrorism itself, and back to Dr. Krugkamp, and his need for specificity, which I agree with, terrorism itself is not a crime. Terrorism is a political reality. The crime is what you do to foster the terrorism. That is, Joseph Vilas-Kashvili to rob the bank to get the money to fund his revolution. So that's the terrorism, is the reason, the motivation for the committing of the crime, the common law crime. So this common crime of moving money for illegal purposes is in fact a common crime, but it's more than that when you can attach the terroristic purpose to it, the political purpose to it. So that's one of the reasons why we need transnational courts to deal with things like piracy, to deal with things like war crimes, because we need to go into the political motivation, and that needs to be determined rationally by a court of law.
Thank you, Dr. Armstead. Dr. Krokop?
Barend, if I can just say, yeah, what I find interesting looking to you guys is that, and I may be wrong, but there are two ways, at least two ways, I'm sure there are many more, two things that source or fund terrorism. And the one is, for instance, if say state security agencies or countries or strong actors in the economy somewhere else actually fund by buying arms, buying weapons, buying the equipment, transporting personnel, etc. In other words, they fund the ideal, which then is enforced by a form of terrorism. But what I find particularly interesting is when some of these groupings actually start their own businesses. They would, for instance, and I'm sure you're aware of it, they would, for instance, say go into rhino horn trade, and which they then export. So they create a criminal network, which is a business. They create their own business to fund themselves, if you wish. So not all forms of terrorism is funded from the outside. It quite often becomes a sort of a business, and then it elevates to the level of terrorism. And it might have different justifications, but the source of it, the funding of it, could be varied and very, very different.
Thank you, Dr. Krokop. I think I just want to add myself something to this. In fact, I listened to you and I agree with you all. I think what makes northern Mozambique especially relevant to this conversation is the fact that there are a lot of resources. And to come back to the question that was asked about the financial institutions, is if we would say that they would these terrorist groups wants to usurp these resources in the northern part of Mozambique, then somewhere down the line, they will have to take this informal source of resources which they gather. They have to go and put it into a formal system, banking system. And what we found in South Africa, unfortunately, in the last few years, was that there were several accounts where we actually knew that the money that was being paid into these accounts, formal banking accounts, came from illicit sources. And the banks didn't do anything about that. Now, there's a particular case now on that in South Africa. So I think the takeaway here is that banking and financial institutions have very much a role to play. But sometimes I think they also get a little bit greedy and allow these millions and even billions of dollars to go through their system as they can make money on that regard. I think that's a very good question that was asked. I want to move on. There's a very good question that was asked from the Russian embassy. If I can repeat it for the panel, they are asking what can be done about the situation in Mozambique, not to let it spread further to the Southern African region. If I can have the panel responding to that.
If I could try, sure. I think that the situation, there was a lot of own goals in terms of Mozambique. What is clear is that the Mozambican government is unable to deal with the situation on its own. I think they made lots of mistakes, including, just by the way, making use of an anti-poaching private military operation for what is a counterinsurgency warfare. As I pointed out, the situation in northern Mozambique can be quelled with the right counterinsurgency taking place. But at the same time, for example, if South Africa plays a role, we have to watch for blowback, because we know that there were lots of South Africans who got trained in Mozambican camps. We know that there were connections between sectors of South African society and these Mozambican militants. We know for a fact that there were South Africans who got training in Raqqa. The question is, if we get involved in Mozambique, what's the blowback for South Africa, given the current lousy status of our security forces domestically? Okay, so as I said, counterinsurgency warfare in my presentation can be done, and it will ensure negative peace in northern Mozambique. But for you to have positive peace, there has to be development, there has to be governance. The issue of drugs, the issue of organized crime, the issue of the penetration of the Mozambican security services by the bad guys is problematic. The nature of Frelimo governance has to be questioned. And that's the problem. You know, you can make use of security forces and it's a band-aid, but unless these structural issues are resolved, it's going to spread. And unfortunately, I'm not very hopeful right now. Maybe if I increase my dosage of Prozac, I would be. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Dr. Crowcombe, did you want to say something? I said Professor Armstead's hand is up as well. Dr. Crowcombe, you can go ahead. You must just unmute.
Okay. No, I thought just Dr. Armstead was before me. I just think that one of the things that, and I think my colleague is right there, that there will be a sort of a blowback. But if we have we set up in SADC a set of relations where we have a broader agreement, say with the Russians and with the Americans and with other dominant role players in the world, that if this should spread, it will be considered a spread against a larger phenomenon or a larger regime. In other words, these people can expect the Americans or the Russians or whoever to get involved if this thing has spread beyond the borders, because it looks like, and I might be wrong, I'm sure I'm wrong, it looks like it's an organism with a life of its own in a very particular region, and it's sourced from that particular region, and it has a vested interest in being active in that particular region. So when does it develop an interest to become a broader phenomenon beyond that particular ecology where it's functioning now? And I think the way to perhaps draw a type of borderline around that is to involve, through diplomatic ties, through international relations, a set of rules and regulations that should this thing spread beyond that particular area. I'm not saying you're condoning it by saying if it spreads further, you can do what you do there, but if it spreads further, you're in trouble. But there must be consequences for reaching beyond where the problem is, and then you try to enter that particular area to get a solution to it too. But if the Russians in some other way can develop a relationship, say for instance, with the South African government, a diplomatic relationship, but more than that, that explains that the South African military doesn't have the capacity to defend itself. And this type of phenomenon which occurs there is a conventional style of military defense against that will simply not work. It's a more complicated phenomenon. I think then it's possible to, through international relations and diplomatic relations, to make it very clear and very known that should this thing spread across borders, it might have international consequences for that particular organism as it operates in that particular area.
Thank you, Dr. Crowcombe. Professor Armstead, just unmute, sir.
Yes, if I can carry Dr. Crowcombe's point a little further. I mentioned that when the John Foster Dulles and President Truman started looking at the issue of collective defense, that we understood one nation couldn't solve many problems by itself. We now have the concept of collective security. Collective security, and I didn't talk about it in my talk, but collective security goes beyond just defense. It isn't just a name change. If we think of two nations coming together, having an agreement that your courts and police work together, Interpol, the International Police Force, for example, very effective in Europe in going after drug traffickers, not terrorism, but certainly transnational crime. If we look in Africa at the smuggling of natural resources, the rhino horn problem, for example, that's an international problem. It's transnational legally. So that's a second tier. The third tier, a common banking system. Banking is international. I mean, we move money all the time. Tomorrow morning, a good friend of mine in London purchased something for me 2 weeks ago that I couldn't buy here at the reduced cost in London. I'm going to go to the bank and transfer funds to him. So we use international banking transfer all the time. If we think of violence, one of the characteristics of the state is, as we understand it, since 1649 with the Peace of Westphalia, violence is the prerogative of states, international violence. So national violence is the police power. It's the prerogative of a state. In the past, money has been the province of the state. You couldn't print your own money. It is a crime to counterfeit money. If we have the new understanding of banking that goes beyond that, in that we can have these private, secret, digital currencies, then no longer is money and the use of money, legitimately otherwise, the prerogative of the state. So now we're asking banks to police human conduct in the way that states used to. That's a whole new concept, and we need to think that through, I think, very carefully before making that decision. But clearly, that's one of the things as we start using digital currency that we have to think about. Relating that to our topic of terrorism, if you have a way to move money transnationally secretly, we don't know where it originates, we don't know where it goes, you're now allowing the kinds of connections that I would like to see as an international lawyer, as a security analyst. I'd like to see that still stay within the unique prerogative of the state. I don't want that to go outside. I think that's very, very dangerous.
Absolutely, thank you. I don't see any more questions. We're over our time. I want to thank all the presenters for your presentations. I really want to thank all of the participants for sitting with us until this time. I hope you provided some insight. I hope that you know where our university is now, and I hope that you know us a little bit more. And I invite anybody to get in touch with us in the future, that we can do and cooperate and maybe work together on some research projects, or even exchange of ideas and all of our things that we're doing in a collaborative manner. I'm going to leave by giving the floor over to Prof who is going to give off the final words of advice to you. Prof Pahu.
Thank you, Dr. Prinsloo. Colleagues, thank you so much for staying with us with a highly enlightened panel that really took us through to these security issues. I just want to, before I just give a quick overview, I'll be very brief, to also recognize and acknowledge the attendance of our dean. He actually left at 10, and so I just wanted to thank him for taking time out of his busy schedule to quickly sneak into our program and left. But colleagues, you will agree with me that the event was a successful event, and my views are, if you my understanding is, if you look at what Dr. Grobler has said, she mentioned a number of issues, but that the role of social media is here to stay, is at the front line, and we need to understand its role in the security issues even much more closely. So there are a lot of lessons in her speech. But also, Prof. Solomon's raised a number of issues, colleagues, in his talk on the failure of counterterrorism. And I think at the core of his presentation is that there are underlying issues, and he said some are issues of poverty, but when states intervene, they actually leave the society and people behind in their interventions. And that becomes problematic because it quickly becomes the state against the local needs of the people, and they label people terrorists. So we have to find ways of helping public policy makers to understand that conventional ways of actually addressing issues of security needs to be re-looked in as far as the new questions of security are concerned, such as insurgents. But I think also briefly, our guest from California, who actually spent 2 days with us here discussing the issues of security, expand a little bit more on what Professor Solomon is saying, that Africa needs a coordinated policy, and this has been on the radar for a very long time, and that conventional ways of military strategy have not actually assisted other countries, and it's not going to assist Africa or South Africa or SADC in that regard. But I think the last speaker was also, raised a number of important considerations in trying to relate the question of security to state security, and that we need to understand what we are talking about. Until we understand what we mean by, for example, state security, what we mean by state capture, whatever intervention that we are going to apply there will not necessarily respond to the issues we want to deal with. So I'm not going to go much into this, colleagues, but oh yes, the last point I wanted to say about what Dr. Krokamp was saying is that when we look at the state security situation in South Africa and apply the concept of state capture instead of informalization, we are making a very big problem, and this also can even spill into other countries in the SADC region. That can even make the situation even much more complex, because essentially we failed to understand the situation. What I've just done, colleagues, was just to demonstrate to you how confused I am with what our speakers have done. And I think they've done very well to achieve their purpose of scholarly presenting their arguments so that we remain confused. And I think in our state of confusion, we are able to go back and reflect and think through this in our debates and our policy processes. Having said that, colleagues, I want to thank you and wish you a very fruitful day. I want to wish you a very good morning, Jim, as well in California. Thank you so much, colleagues. Have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you.